CCP mouthpiece The Global Times announces an end to the lockdown of Xi'an, but reports indicate that this declaration might not be entirely accurate. As the Olympic Games draw ever closer, lockdowns in Beijing grow increasingly severe. A report from Bitter Winter details the methods through which the CCP is exterminating the Tibetan culture. Lockdowns are destroying Hong Kong's status as an international finance hub, and new legislation threatens to further erode the city's rapidly dying freedoms. Welcome to the show. I'm the Inspector, and this is the Nord Report. On January 24th, Chinese state media, The Global Times, published an article declaring that the month-long lockdowns in Xi'an, a city of 13 million, were being gradually lifted. We are told that the local government released a statement on its official account on Sino Weibo, detailing a series of regulations to ensure the resumption of normal production and life in the city in an orderly manner. Taken at face value, the article gives the impression that life in the city is pretty much returning to normal. That impression seems to be the one circulating within Western media. In this article from the Associated Press, we are told that Xi'an lifted a lockdown Monday that had isolated its 13 million people for a month. The New York Times also reported that China lifts a month-long lockdown on the 13 million residents of the city of Xi'an. But is this really the case? In last week's episode, I discussed some of the challenges with getting accurate news about current events in China. I mentioned the CCP's control of Chinese media, and some of the measures they use to control the flow of information. I'm mentioning this now because those points are relevant to how I interpret stories like this. The articles from AP News and the New York Times seem to me to be exclusively based on the report from the Global Times. And the problem with taking that report at face value is that, as a state-run media outlet, stories published by the Global Times are unlikely to contain information that the CCP doesn't want people to know. And as such, I'm inherently skeptical to the notion that their publications tell the full story. I guess you could say that I have a distrust and verify sort of mindset. And with that in mind, let's take a look at what outlets that share my bias have to say about the situation. According to the following article from Radio Free Asia, Xi'an residents say that while the authorities claim the lockdown is over, they are still under tight restrictions. Radio Free Asia reportedly conducted an interview with one of the locals. To protect the local's identity, we're only given her surname, Chen. Let's take a look at what she had to say about the situation in Xi'an. All that's happened is that I'm now allowed to go out once every couple of days to buy my own supplies, and the prices have come down a bit. But if we can't leave the residential compound, then we're stuck buying overpriced groceries from stalls at the compound gate, and that's not acceptable. Since January 20th, residents have only been allowed out every other day to buy supplies, but may only stay out for up to 2 hours. And there is still the risk that a person's health code app could turn red while they are making that trip, barring them from getting back to their own home. Based on this report, it certainly seems like some of the restrictions have been lifted, but that's a far cry from claiming that the lockdowns in general have been lifted, and certainly does not seem to align with the claim made by the Global Times that regular production and life in the city is resuming. Another report that runs counter to the official CCP narrative comes courtesy of NTD's China in Focus. Let's take a look.
In a viral video clip, a Xi'an resident tells her story.
It happened that one day when I went to take a shuttle in that neighborhood, I scanned the QR code there. Then a positive case was confirmed there. So now I'm required to go home to quarantine for 7 days. The authorities told me to go home as soon as possible, as people in my neighborhood are waiting for me, to put a seal on my door. They won't wait for me, as they are to finish their work.
She says she tried to take a taxi home, but soon the driver kicked her out. At that point, she was over 20 miles away from home. Finding herself in a sticky situation, she reached out to community leaders for help.
Even in this situation, the neighborhood management kept telling me to figure a way out myself, that it's none of their business. For food or other supplies, they don't care either, telling me so make it by myself. I told them there is no way to cook in my apartment, and I don't have any food or supplies. And since my health code turns red, I cannot go to any supermarket. I have to be quarantined for 7 days, and I'm not allowed to ask for food delivery. I asked, what if I die of starving? Then the local authorities still kept saying the same thing. Figure it out yourself. Figure it out yourself. Figure it out yourself.
A second report indicates that at least one protest has recently taken place in the city.
This video shows a protest in Xi'an City. residents have reportedly been forbidden to buy groceries independently. Instead, they've had to source their food from the property's management. But the cost of those groceries is high, almost 5 times more than usual. At the time, they had been required to comply for a month already. Then some residents last week said they would not comply, and police arrested them. Other homeowners then gathered to demand that the police to set the captives free.
As I pointed out in last week's episode, I can't personally verify these reports. That being said, if you were to ask me who I consider more trustworthy, 10 out of 10, I would pick Radio Free Asia and NTD over the CCP. One detail that I would like to draw your attention to is the fact that food was mentioned as a problem in all 3 of the reports we just covered. Over the past month, Xi'an residents have been told that groceries were limited due to the pandemic. However, it now seems to be the case that one reason why groceries were limited is because government officials have been dumping the food in the trash.
你看这人浪费不浪费？把这么多的馍都撂了，大家都看。
疫情说吃不上菜，看，整箱整箱的菜，就这样全扔了。看看看看，哎呀，扒开看看啊，这西葫芦好好的全扔了，一整箱一整箱的。那是。这都不知道是什么地方人家给捐过来的，还是哪儿来的？不知道吗？豆角，看全是豆角。看这箱子连打都没打开，哎呀。这都不是人干的事儿吗？就把这全部扔垃圾堆了。
Now, why on earth would anybody do something like this? According to this story from the Chinese language edition of the Epoch Times, the food was donated by Chinese citizens seeking to aid the residents of Xi'an. However, instead of delivering the donations to starving people, it seems like some local CCP officials have trashed the donations in order to monopolize the sale of groceries, thus ratcheting up the prices. You know, maybe I was wrong after all. I mean, it seems like the official narrative was announced to hide the fact that CCP officials are cynically exploiting the Chinese citizens for profit by restricting their freedoms and access to food. I guess things in Xi'an really are going back to normal. This just in. A new study suggests a boot stamping on a human face forever may help prevent the spread of coronavirus. At least, that's what it seems like the CCP would have us believe. On January 25th, Big Daddy Xi Jinping met with President of the International Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach. According to CCP mouthpiece China Daily, during the meeting, Xi declared that China is all set to deliver a simple, safe, and splendid Winter Olympics. Now, while I can't read Mandarin, I can read between the lines. When dictator Xi uses the words simple, safe, and splendid, what he really means is simple, safe, and splendid with Chinese characteristics. Let's examine what that entails. In the following article from AP News, we learn that as of January 25th, at least 6 Beijing neighborhoods have been targeted for lockdowns, one of which was the Anzhen residential community, which lies about 2 kilometers from the main Olympic village. There, residents were confined to their homes from Sunday morning until Tuesday afternoon. A notice said one building remained under isolation. On January 26th, all 2 million residents of Fengtai district are being tested for the 3rd time since last weekend. Some areas of the district have been locked down, with residents not allowed to leave their housing complex or neighborhood. On January 30th, Beijing officials announced that they had sealed off several residential compounds north of the city center after 2 cases of COVID-19 were found. One example of these measures can be found in the Chaoyang district, where residents of one neighborhood were locked down and forbidden from leaving their compound. Despite the continuous application of leather footwear to Chinese faces, the CCP has, somehow, failed to prevent Omicron from breaching the Olympic bubble. And when I say bubble, I literally mean bubble. The participants in the games stay in hotels that have been surrounded by temporary walls. They come and go only in special vehicles that take them directly to the venues or other Olympics facilities. The public is not allowed to enter the hotel properties or the venues, though a limited number of spectators will be let in for the events. Truly, this is a marvelous display of simplicity and splendor with Chinese characteristics. On the note of safety, in last week's episode I reported that human rights groups had advised Olympic athletes to avoid speaking out against the CCP's abuses while in China. This week, however, some human rights advocates have taken the opposite stance. As reported by AP News, during an online press conference organized by the rights group Human Rights Watch, activists representing Chinese dissidents and the minority Uyghur and Tibetan populations urged international attendants to voice their opposition to China's hosting of the Games. During the press conference, Ladon Tethong, director of the Tibet Action Institute, addressed the attending athletes directly. "Your silence is their strength. This is what they want more than anything, that the world will play by China's rules, that we will follow China's lead, and that we will look away from these atrocities and crimes for the sake of business as usual. I personally believe that you should use your platform and your privilege and this historic opportunity. You have to speak out against the wave of genocide." Personally, while I find that sentiment admirable, I don't think it's likely that any of the athletes are going to speak out during the Games. Like me, I get the feeling that they are proficient at reading between the lines, which means they probably know what safety with Chinese characteristics entails. And on that note, according to Reuters, at least one US Olympian, who spoke to them on the condition of anonymity, has said that she would not be speaking out on human rights because she believes doing so would put her safety at risk, stating, "I think China has shown, with Peng Shuai most recently, that they are willing to go to really extreme measures to silence any sort of rhetoric that they find displeasing." In last week's episode, I covered the story of Tashi Wangchuk, a Tibetan intellectual who was threatened with imprisonment for advocating for the preservation of the Tibetan language on Chinese social media. This segment is, in many ways, a continuation of that story. On January 25th, Bitter Winter, a magazine on religious liberty and human rights, published an article detailing what they call the cultural genocide of Tibet. The CCP's oppression of Tibet is, of course, nothing new. In 2021, human rights group Freedom House ranked Tibet alongside Syria as the least free places in the world. However, while the oppression is not new, over the past couple of years, it seems to have increased in severity. Throughout 2021, there were numerous reports of Chinese police evicting monks and nuns after forcibly closing their monasteries. A Tibetan Buddhist community in eastern Tibet was subjected to a political education drive aimed towards indoctrination of the monastic population. Under that decree, they were forced to identify themselves with the Great Motherland, the Chinese nation, Chinese culture, the Chinese Communist Party, and socialism with Chinese characteristics. All across Tibet, numerous religious statues have been torn down and destroyed. On the linguistic front, numerous private schools offering classes in the Tibetan language have been forcibly shut down. Other schools have been threatened with forced closure if they failed to accept Mandarin as the medium of instruction. And, in July 2021, the Chinese Ministry of Education issued a decree forcing Tibetan children in preschools across Tibet to learn Mandarin. More shockingly still, according to a report published by the Tibet Action Institute in December 2021, approximately 800,000 Tibetan students have been separated from their families and forced to join state-run boarding schools. This represents roughly 3/4 of all children living in Tibet. According to the article, within the schools, Tibetan students are not only separated from their families and communities, but are also subjected to intensive political indoctrination, compelled to study Chinese, and prohibited from practicing their religion and culture. Unfortunately, Tibetan children are not the only ones subject to this kind of treatment. Beginning in 2020, the Chinese government has launched a large-scale coercive labor program across Tibet, whereby Tibetans are forcibly subjected to thought transformation, intrusive surveillance, political re-education, military-style training, and punitive punishments. In February 2021, CCP officials announced that 700,000 Tibetan farmers and nomads would become the next targets of these coercive labor programs. The article ends by comparing the current situation in Tibet to the one in 2008. That year is significant for two reasons. It was the last time China was host to the Olympic Games, and that is the year in which demonstrations against the CCP broke out all over Tibet. According to the article, the outbreak of the historic uprisings in Tibet in 2008 was foreshadowed by an intensified attack on Tibetan religion and culture in all forms and manners earlier in 2007. Given all of these similarities, it seems possible that we might soon witness another Tibetan mass uprising relatively soon. That possibility is at least something the CCP seems to be taking seriously, as Beijing has reportedly already begun to tighten its security across Tibet ahead of the forthcoming Olympics, as mass mobilizations of its armed forces and travel restrictions have been imposed in Tibetan cities. Considering that the CCP hasn't exactly become more tolerant of dissent since 2008, I find it hard to imagine that such an uprising would go well for the Tibetans. But I mean, what are they going to do? Maintaining the status quo doesn't exactly seem like a viable option. Honestly, without outside intervention, it seems to me like the Tibetans are damned if they do, and damned if they don't. Speaking of damned groups that just can't seem to catch a break, the CCP's zero COVID policy has now come for Hong Kong. Unfortunately, the situation there is about as rough as you might expect. In an article from January 28th, Reuters paints a grim picture of the situation. Hong Kong is scrambling to sustain a zero COVID policy that has turned one of the world's most densely packed cities into one of the most isolated. Flights out of Hong Kong's international airport are down around 90%. Over 8,000 people are locked down in government quarantine facilities and a congested housing block, while 900,000 students have been shut out of school since the start of this week. Once one of the world's most connected places, Hong Kong is reeling from the closure of its borders, impacting the free flow of people and the availability of food and foreign products the city is so highly dependent on. Hong Kong was, until recently, a leading international business hub, but these lockdowns seem to be bringing that arrangement to an end. The city has a prominent expatriate population, and those lucky individuals who happen to not be Chinese citizens seem ready to abandon the sinking ship. According to another report by Reuters, the city's European Chamber of Commerce released a report which stated, Hong Kong may not reopen until early 2024 because of its strict COVID-19 policies, which could trigger an exodus of foreign firms and staff and jeopardize the city's role as a financial hub. The following article from AP News reports something similar. An international center of finance and trade, the city has a prominent expatriate population, some of whom are beginning to chafe at the travel controls and other restrictions. A survey released this month by the American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong showed that more than 40% of members surveyed were more likely to leave because of the restrictions. If I were to speculate, I'd guess this is bad news for the unfortunate Chinese citizens unable to escape the city. Given the amount of money Hong Kong generates, I might have imagined that the citizens would at least be spared some of the CCP's worst excesses, such as the ones currently taking place in Xinjiang and Tibet. That guess appears to have been mistaken, because, as of now, it really seems like the CCP is willing to do whatever it takes to choke the life out of the city. And if Hong Kong were to lose its status as an international finance hub, then I guess the CCP really won't have anything left to lose in the city. On that note, lockdowns are not the only problem coming for Hong Kong. As reported by Reuters, on January 26th, Hong Kong's security chief, Chris Tang, announced that his government would strengthen laws against espionage as part of extra national security legislation now being drafted. As well as targeting espionage, Tang said the proposed legislation would outline specific crimes of treason, sedition, theft of state secrets, as well as forbidding activities by foreign political groups inside Hong Kong and ties between such groups and local organizations. For your information, Article 23 of Hong Kong's constitution says the city must enact laws on its own against crimes including treason, secession, theft of state secrets, and activities by foreign political groups. The last time the CCP attempted to amend Article 23 was back in 2003, and those efforts were shelved following a wave of mass protests from citizens who saw the legislation as a threat to Hong Kong's special freedoms. Well, today, those special freedoms are truly dead and buried, and so this time the proposed legislation will likely be introduced later this year. Reuters ends the article with a statement from CCP officials who say the law was vital to ensure stability after the Asian financial hub was rocketed by sometimes violent pro-democracy protests for much of 2019, and say prosecutions are not political. Well then, if the CCP says so, then I guess this is much ado about nothing. I'm sure the citizens of Hong Kong have nothing to worry about. Right? Somehow, I very much doubt that, and so does Radio Free Asia. In the following article, they discuss the proposed legislation and provide us with an example of what the CCP considers sedition. Tang's warning came after the authorities appointed a designated national security judge to preside in the trial of 5 speech therapists who were charged with conspiracy to print, publish, distribute, display, or reproduce seditious publications. And so what were these seditious publications? Well, the defendants were arrested in July 2021 after publishing 3 children's books that portrayed sheep uniting to defend their village against invading wolves, a plotline that the authorities said incited hatred of the authorities. The defendants have been denied bail as the charges against them are deemed a matter of national security. The national security judge that will reportedly preside over the trial is one Kwok Wai Kin. That guy was reportedly temporarily suspended from duty after expressing sympathy in court for a defendant accused of stabbing protesters during the 2019 protest movement. But hey, the CCP has said that prosecutions of this nature won't be political, and so I'm sure the defendants have nothing to worry about. And with that, we've reached the end of this week's episode. Thanks for watching, and be sure to tune in again next week for more updates. Until then, get after it and stay free.